June 20th, 1980. Friday morning, Mahwah, New Jersey. The assembly line is still running. Men and women move through their stations the same way they have for 25 years. Bolt, weld, fit, move on. The fluorescent lights hum above 10 miles of conveyor. The noise is the same noise it has always been. But something is different. Everyone knows. This is the last shift. By afternoon, the final car rolls off the line. Workers gather in the parking lot. Some stand in silence. Some can't look at each other. The gates close for the last time, and the roar that once echoed through the Ramapough Mountains, the roar of the largest auto plant in America, goes quiet. 4,500 jobs gone in a single day. But here's what the headlines didn't tell you. Ford didn't just leave Mahwah. They left something behind, something buried in the hills, something that is still there today. This is the story of America's biggest auto factory and the two ways it died. In the summer of 1953, Ford Motor Company sent a team of engineers north out of New York City on Route 17, up through the flatlands of Bergen County, past the suburbs thinning into farmland, until the road curved west into the foothills of the Ramapough Mountains. They were looking for land, cheap land, a lot of it. They found it in Mahwah. The town sat at the edge of New Jersey, pressed against the New York state line, with the Ramapough River running cold along its western border. Population, a few thousand. Tax rate, among the lowest in the county. The Erie Railroad ran straight through it, and the land, broad, flat, and largely undeveloped, was exactly what Ford needed. The plan was enormous. Ford wanted to replace its aging Edgewater assembly plant, a cramped facility perched along the Hudson River that had been cobbled together over decades and could no longer keep pace with post-war demand. What they built at Mahwah would be something different entirely, something that had never existed before in American manufacturing. Construction began in 1954. The numbers were staggering. 2.4 million square feet of manufacturing and office space. More than 50 acres under a single roof. 10 miles of assembly aisles running beneath banks of fluorescent light. A private railroad spur connecting directly to the Erie main line so that freight cars loaded with steel, glass, and engine components could roll straight into the building without ever touching a public road. The parking lots alone covered dozens of acres. When a Brinks armored truck arrived every 2 weeks on payday, it wasn't making a single stop. It was making a circuit, window to window, station to station, cashing checks for thousands of workers who never had to leave the building to get paid. On July 16, 1955, the Mahwah assembly plant opened its doors. At the time of its completion, it was the largest motor vehicle assembly plant in the United States. The town of Mahwah felt it immediately. Ford's property taxes alone reshaped the local budget. Homeowners in Mahwah paid some of the lowest property tax rates in northern New Jersey, not because the town was poor, but because Ford was footing so much of the bill. Roads were paved. Schools were funded. A community that had been a quiet footnote between two states suddenly had a reason to exist on the map. Workers came from everywhere, from the working-class neighborhoods of Brooklyn and the Bronx, from Patterson and Hoboken, from Orange and Rockland County across the state line. They came because the wages were real wages, steady, union-negotiated, enough to make a life on. UAW Local 906 represented the workforce, and from the first contract, the pay was serious, triple the federal minimum wage at its peak. Men and women who had grown up with nothing suddenly had something to protect: a paycheck, a mortgage, a future. The plant ran 2 shifts, sometimes 3. The assembly line never fully slept. At any hour of the day or night, somewhere inside that building, a frame was being lowered onto a chassis, a door was being fitted to a body, an engine was being dropped into place. The process was relentless and precise, a kind of controlled chaos that produced, on a good day, close to 1,000 vehicles. Ford called the plant's operations Mahwah Assembly. The workers called it something simpler. They called it the plant. And in 1955, for the men and women who walked through its doors for the first time, It felt less like a factory and more like a promise that the post-war American economy had made, and was for once keeping, that if you showed up, if you worked hard, if you gave your time and your labor to something larger than yourself, the country would give something back. The gates opened. The line started moving. The first car rolled off the floor of the largest auto plant in America. 25 years later, it would be the last. The Thunderbird came first, not the original, that was born in Dearborn. But when Ford needed a second home for its most glamorous nameplate, Mahwah got the call. The Thunderbird rolled off the New Jersey line in the late 1950s alongside the full-size Fords that were the backbone of the American market. The Galaxy, the Fairlane, the LTD. Big cars, heavy cars. Cars with long hoods and wide rear decks, and V8 engines that drank gasoline the way the country drank optimism, without thinking about tomorrow. The Mahwah plant built them all. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the line ran at a pace that was almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. 1,000 vehicles a day, 2 shifts, 5 days a week, year after year. Frames arrived by rail from the Midwest. Glass came in from Toledo. Engines dropped in from Cleveland. The Erie Railroad spur that ran into the building handled a constant flow of freight. High-cube boxcars full of components. Auto-rack cars rolling out loaded with finished vehicles headed for dealerships across the Northeast. Inside the plant, the rhythm was everything. Every worker had a station. Every station had a task. Every task had a time, measured not in minutes but in seconds. Miss your window and the car moved on without you, and a supervisor was already at your shoulder. Hit your window every time for 8 hours, and you went home with something that mattered. A paycheck that could carry a family. What does it mean to build 6 million cars? 6 million families driving to work, to school, to the hospital, to church. 6 million first road trips. 6 million drives home from the dealership, still smelling the factory on the upholstery. The men and women of Mahwah didn't just build machines. They built the physical infrastructure of daily American life in the post-war decades. One bolt, one weld, one shift at a time, and the wages made it real. At its peak, a Mahwah assembly worker earned wages that put them firmly in the American middle class. Union-negotiated pay that climbed steadily through the 1960s, backed by benefits that included health insurance, pensions, and paid vacation. For many workers, it was the first job in their family's history that paid enough to own a home, not rent. Own. Workers from Brooklyn and the Bronx, from Patterson and Passaic, bought houses in northern New Jersey and Rockland County. They sent their children to college. They took vacations they hadn't grown up believing were possible. On payday, the Brinks truck made its rounds through the plant. Workers would line up at the caged windows, press their badges to the glass, and walk away with cash in hand. It was a ritual that carried weight beyond the money itself. It was proof. Proof that the work was real, that the wages were real, that the life being built around those wages was real. By the mid-1960s, employment had reached 5,000 workers. The annual payroll topped $80 million. The Mahwah assembly plant was not just the largest auto plant in America. It was the economic engine of an entire region. Nobody thought it would ever stop. The 1960s were the years of certainty. Detroit was invincible. American steel was invincible. The assembly line was the great equalizer. It didn't matter where you came from, what your last name was, whether you had finished high school. If you could show up on time and keep pace with the line, you had a place. And that place came with a wage that could change the trajectory of a family in a single generation. At Mahwah, the plant kept expanding its roster of models. The Edsel had come and gone. Ford's famous miscalculation, built at Mahwah among other plants, pulled from production after barely 2 years. But the Edsel's failure barely registered on the floor. The line simply pivoted. New models arrived to replace old ones. The Galaxy, the Monarch, the Granada, the F-Series trucks, which rolled out of Mahwah alongside the passenger cars and found their way onto job sites and farm roads across the Northeast. The plant was flexible in a way that felt permanent. capable of absorbing whatever Detroit needed built and sending it out the other side. The workers built a community around the work. UAW Local 906 became one of the most active union halls in northern New Jersey. Grievances were filed, contracts were negotiated, and the relationship between labor and management at Mahwah was, by most accounts, functional, if never entirely warm. The union protected the wage protected the family built the town. Mahwah itself remained small, quiet, almost deliberately modest. The plant dominated the local economy without dominating the local identity. Residents went about their lives. Their kids played Little League. Their churches filled on Sundays, while a few miles away, 10 miles of assembly line ran through the night. The two worlds coexisted in a kind of comfortable parallel, each sustaining the other without much acknowledgement. Then 1973 arrived. The oil embargo hit in October of that year, and the country that had never thought about gasoline suddenly thought about nothing else. Lines stretched around city blocks at filling stations. Prices doubled. The federal government imposed a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour, and American consumers, for the first time in the post-war era, began looking seriously at the small, fuel-efficient cars coming in from Japan, Toyotas, Datsuns, Hondas, that cost less to buy and a fraction of the price to fill. Mahwah built big cars. It had always built big cars. The LTD, the Galaxy, the Granada. These were vehicles designed for a country that assumed gasoline would always be cheap and plentiful. That assumption was now broken, and it was not going to be repaired. The line kept moving. The workers kept showing up. The paychecks kept coming. But something had shifted beneath the surface of things, something that wouldn't become visible for several more years, but was already in motion. In 1973, at the peak of its output, Mahwah Assembly was producing close to 1,000 vehicles a day and employing thousands of workers across 2 full shifts. The roar of the line filled the building from wall to wall. No one on the floor that October knew they were already in the last chapter. While the assembly line ran at full roar, Ford was quietly solving a problem. Every car that rolled off the Mahwah floor had been painted, and paint, at industrial scale, generates waste. Enormous, continuous, chemically complex waste. The spray booths produced thousands of gallons of paint sludge every single day. Thick, heavy material laced with lead, arsenic, chromium, and benzene. Material that couldn't be poured down a drain or buried in a corner of the lot. Material that needed to go somewhere. Ford found somewhere. In 1965, a Ford subsidiary called Ringwood Realty purchased a 500-acre tract of land in Ringwood, New Jersey, just across the state line into New York's orbit, tucked into the folds of the Ramapough Mountains about a half-mile north of the plant's reach. The land had once been an iron mining district, worked for centuries, and then abandoned in the early 1900s when the ore ran out. What remained were rugged forests, overgrown hillsides, and a network of abandoned mine shafts and open pits dropping deep into the earth. Ford did not buy it for the scenery. The purchase was made, according to the New Jersey lawsuit filed decades later, for the express purpose of using the land as a private landfill for hazardous waste generated at the Mahwah plant. Beginning in 1967, trucks began making the run from the factory floor to the Ringwood Hills. Day after day, load after load, paint sludge, drummed chemicals, industrial solvent waste, was hauled up into the mountains and disposed of, into the open pits, into the abandoned mine shafts, onto the forest floor. The sludge hardened as it cooled, forming bright, colorful slabs that looked almost decorative against the dark soil. Vivid reds and yellows and blues that had no business existing in a forest. The Ramapough Lenape Nation had lived in these mountains for centuries. They were there before New Jersey was a colony, before the iron mines brought European settlers into the hills, before Route 17 was paved and the suburbs crept northward. The Ramapough, a people of mixed Lenape, African, and European ancestry, formally recognized as a tribe by the state of New Jersey, had stayed when everyone else left, building their lives around the land the way their ancestors had, hunting and fishing and farming in the Ramapough Hills that outsiders had always considered too remote to bother with. When Ford's trucks began arriving in 1967, The Ramapough had no way of knowing what was being left behind. The sludge was colorful. Children played near it. Some families scavenged the debris from the dump sites, looking for copper and salvageable metals to sell. The bright paint slabs became a feature of the landscape. Curiosities, not warnings. Nobody told the community what was in the ground. Nobody posted signs. Nobody knocked on doors. Ford's internal documents, later obtained through litigation and investigative reporting, would show that company officials understood the nature of what was being deposited at Ringwood. They understood it was hazardous. They understood the land was inhabited, and they kept sending the trucks anyway. From 1967 to 1974, thousands of tons of toxic material disappeared into the hills above Ringwood. The line at Mahwah kept moving, the sludge kept coming, and the mountains kept their secret. By the early 1970s, Ford was ready to move on. Not from Mahwah, the plant was still running, still productive, still employing thousands. But from Ringwood, the dump sites were filling up, the liability was growing, and Ford's internal memos, written in the early 1970s, reflected a single overriding priority: get rid of the land before anyone looked too closely. The strategy was methodical. In 1970, Ringwood Realty donated 290 acres of the contaminated tract to Ringwood Borough. The borough, unaware of what it was receiving, eventually used the donated land as a municipal landfill. That same year, another portion was sold to a utility company. In 1973, Ford's subsidiary donated 109 acres to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, which absorbed the acreage into Ringwood State Park, a public park open to hikers and families, built on top of thousands of tons of buried industrial poison. 35 more acres went to a nonprofit. By 1974, Ringwood Realty owned nothing at Ringwood Mines. Ford had given away the evidence, and here is the detail that transforms negligence into something darker. When Ford donated and sold those parcels, they did not disclose the contamination to the recipients. Not to the borough, not to the state, not to the nonprofit. The new owners received deeds, not warnings. They received acreage, not the truth about what was in the ground beneath it. Some of that acreage became affordable housing for the Ramapough community. Families built homes on contaminated soil. Children grew up drinking well water drawn from an aquifer that ran beneath the old dump sites. The bright paint slabs that had seemed like curiosities in the 1960s were now part of the landscape of daily life. Near driveways, near stream banks, near the places where kids played after school. Did anyone in Ford's boardroom think about those children? The memos don't say. What they say is that the priority was divestiture. Get out clean, move on. Meanwhile, back at the Mahwah plant, the line kept running. The Fairmonts and Zephyrs were rolling out by the thousands. The payroll was still $84.9 million a year. From the outside, nothing had changed. Ford was still the largest employer in northern New Jersey. The plant was still the economic backbone of an entire region. But the trucks had stopped going to Ringwood. The dump sites were sealed under donated earth, and the poison, lead at 100 times the safe exposure level, arsenic, chromium, benzene, antimony, was slowly moving through the soil, into the groundwater, toward the wells and the streams and the reservoir that supplied drinking water to 2.5 million New Jersey residents downstream. The plant had always made two things at Mahwah: cars and the waste that building cars produced. One of those things Ford sold to the public. The other they buried in a mountain community and walked away from. For the next decade, nobody outside of Ringwood would know what was in the ground. The Ramapough families would begin to notice things: illnesses that clustered strangely, cancers that seemed to skip no one on certain streets. But they had no name for what was happening to them. The name would come later. It always does. The warning came from Detroit. Not publicly, never publicly, but internally, sometime in the mid-1970s, Ford's corporate leadership delivered a message to the managers of its New Jersey plants. Mahwah and Edison had 5 years to get their houses in order, improve quality, stabilize labor relations, reduce costs. If they couldn't, Ford would find plants that could. It was not an idle threat. It was a deadline. The problem was that Mahwah had accumulated years of friction that couldn't be fixed in 5 years. or perhaps in any amount of time short of tearing the plant down and starting over. Labor relations had been contentious through much of the 1960s and into the 1970s. Wildcat strikes had disrupted production on multiple occasions. Quality complaints from dealerships were a recurring irritant. The plant's location, 30 miles from New York City, surrounded by one of the most expensive labor markets in the country, meant that operating costs were structurally higher than at Ford's newer facilities in the South and Midwest, where wages were lower, land was cheaper, and unions were weaker. Detroit's newer plants were leaner, faster, built for a different era. Mahwah was built for 1955, and 1955 was a long time ago. The oil embargo of 1973 had fundamentally rewritten the rules of the American auto market, but the full consequences took years to arrive on the floor of the Mahwah plant. Through the mid-1970s, the line kept moving. The big cars kept selling, not as well as before, but well enough. Ford introduced the Fairmont in 1978, a compact built on the new Fox platform, lighter and more fuel-efficient than the land yachts it was meant to replace. Mahwah got the Fairmont and its Mercury twin, the Zephyr. It was an attempt to pivot, to show Detroit that the plant could build the cars the new market demanded. But the pivot came too late, and the market was moving faster than any single model could follow. By 1979, Japanese automakers held a share of the American market that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Toyota, Datsun, and Honda were not selling novelties anymore. They were selling reliable, affordable, fuel-efficient cars to American families who had grown up believing only Detroit could build a real automobile and who had quietly changed their minds sometime between the first oil shock and the second. The second embargo hit in 1979, following the Iranian Revolution, and gasoline prices spiked again. The timing could not have been worse. Ford's overall sales collapsed. In 1980, the Big Three collectively lost a record $4.2 billion. The worst single-year loss in American automotive history to that point. Ford and Chrysler individually set records for annual losses by an American company. An estimated 300,000 to 500,000 workers across the industry were laid off or furloughed. The UAW, which had spent 4 decades winning concessions from Detroit, suddenly found itself in the unfamiliar position of giving them back. Corporate headquarters in Dearborn looked at its assembly plants the way a captain looks at cargo during a storm. Something had to go overboard. Mahwah was already on the list. On April 15, 1980, Ford made it official. The Mahwah assembly plant would close permanently on June 20, 1980. More than 3,700 union employees would lose their jobs. The announcement came without drama from the corporate side. A press release, a spokesman, a few carefully worded sentences about financial necessity and market conditions. John Cameron, Ford's spokesman in New York, told reporters the decision was final. There were no buyers. There would be no reconsideration. Inside the plant, a foreman described the atmosphere to a Washington Post reporter who showed up the next day. "It's like a morgue in there," he said. "The workers are completely disillusioned." The timing was brutal in a way that went beyond the economics. Mahwah was not a plant that had been slowly winding down. It was still running 2 models, the Fairmont and the Zephyr, that Ford itself was promoting as its answer to the fuel economy crisis. Workers on the floor had spent the previous 2 years retooling for the Fox platform, learning new procedures, adapting to new specifications. They had done what Detroit asked. They had pivoted. And now, 60 days after being told their plant was closing, they were still building the cars Ford needed. For a plant in Metuchen, 50 miles south, that would absorb the production in a fraction of the workforce. Mahwah got the work, Metuchen got the future. The UAW responded with fury that was also beneath the surface, helplessness. Joseph O'Hara, president of UAW Local 906, told reporters that the ripple effects would spread far beyond the plant gates. For every auto worker laid off, he said, 5 to 6 other jobs in the surrounding economy would be affected. Suppliers, restaurants, retailers, service businesses whose customer base was built on the wages of people who worked at the plant. Lois Ciccinello, a UAW regional aide, put it more simply. There was not another major industrial employer within 30 to 40 miles that could absorb the Mahwah workforce. Where they would go for work was, in her words, beyond us. Some workers held on to hope a little longer. Rumors circulated through the floor in those final weeks. A foreign automaker was interested in buying the plant. Datsun, some said. Toyota. Ford's own spokesman acknowledged that the facility was being shown to prospective buyers, including Japanese manufacturers. But the interest never materialized into an offer. The plant was too large, too old, too expensive to retool for a different kind of production. It had been built for an America that no longer existed. Bergen County officials announced a task force to help laid-off workers apply for unemployment benefits, food stamps, and job retraining programs. The federal government had already certified Mahwah workers as eligible for trade adjustment assistance, a program designed specifically for workers whose jobs had been lost to import competition. The paperwork was available. The counselors were being deployed. None of it came close to replacing what was being taken away. The plant kept running through May and into June. The line kept moving. The Fairmonts kept rolling. But the countdown was running underneath everything now, audible to anyone who cared to listen. 60 days, then 40, then 20, then 1. The last 2 months had a texture unlike anything the plant had experienced before. The work was the same. The line moved at the same pace. The bolts went into the same holes. The doors fitted onto the same frames. The engines dropped into the same engine bays. Muscle memory carried the workers through their shifts the way it always had. The body knowing what to do even when the mind was somewhere else entirely. But the conversations in the break room had changed. The parking lot had changed. The way men and women looked at each other across the line had changed. Everyone was doing the math. June 20th was a fixed point on the calendar, and every day that passed brought it closer with a kind of arithmetic cruelty. Workers with 20 years in began calculating their pensions. Workers with 5 years in began calculating how long their savings would last. Workers with mortgages thought about their mortgages. Workers with children in college thought about tuition. The plant had been the answer to so many questions for so long that losing it meant not just losing a paycheck. It meant losing the foundation on which an entire set of assumptions about the future had been built. UAW Local 906 held emergency meetings through April and May. Joseph O'Hara worked the phones to Washington, to Trenton, to Ford's regional offices, looking for any lever that hadn't been tried. Politicians from Bergen and Passaic counties held press conferences condemning the closure. New Jersey's congressional delegation sent letters to Ford's headquarters in Dearborn. The mayor of Mahwah, Joanne Makeley, warned that the impact would be felt not just in northern New Jersey, but in working-class neighborhoods in Brooklyn, in Hoboken, in Patterson, anywhere the plant's workforce had put down roots. None of it moved forward. The company had made its calculation. Mahwah was a cost the balance sheet could no longer carry. In 1979, Ford had lost more money than any American company had ever lost in a single year. The pressure from Dearborn was not political, it was existential. And against existential pressure, press conferences and congressional letters carried exactly the weight Ford assigned them, which was none. What kept some workers going through those 60 days was the rumor. It moved through the floor the way rumors always move in factories, person to person, break room to parking lot, night shift to day shift, growing slightly with each retelling. A foreign automaker was interested, Toyota maybe, or Datsun. Ford was showing the plant to buyers. The facility was too valuable to simply shut down. Someone would step in. Something would happen. Ford's spokesman confirmed that the plant was indeed being shown to prospective buyers, including Japanese manufacturers. He also confirmed that there were no offers. The plant was enormous. 2.4 million square feet, 10 miles of assembly aisle, a private rail spur, 50 acres under one roof. It was built for a scale of production that required an enormous workforce, an enormous supply chain, and an enormous market. Reconfiguring it for a different kind of manufacturing was not a project any buyer could undertake quickly or cheaply. The rumor kept circulating anyway. People needed it too. What do you do when the only job that ever paid enough simply stops existing? You hold on to the rumor. You go back to work. You count the days. By early June, the rumor had died. No buyer had emerged. No congressman had moved forward. No intervention from Trenton or Washington had changed the arithmetic in Dearborn. The plant was closing on June 20th, and everyone inside its walls now knew it with the kind of certainty that settles into the body differently than the mind. The way a diagnosis settles, or a verdict. Not a surprise anymore. Just a fact that had to be lived with. The federal government's Trade Adjustment Assistance Program had processed its paperwork. Workers laid off after January 16th were eligible for extended unemployment benefits, job counseling, and retraining funds. Bergen County's task force was in place. Ford had sent teams of specialists to the plant to help salaried employees find transfers to other facilities, though the company acknowledged that few spots were available and most workers would not be following their jobs anywhere. The math on retraining was grim in ways the official announcements didn't say out loud. The average Mahwah assembly worker was in their late 30s or 40s. They had come to the plant young, learned a set of physical skills specific to automotive assembly, and built a life around the wage those skills commanded. Retraining for what exactly? The economy of northern New Jersey in 1980 was not generating thousands of new jobs that paid union auto wages. The service sector was growing, but service sector wages were not mortgage wages. They were not college tuition wages. They were not the wages of a life that had already been planned around something better. Ford's Metuchen plant, 50 miles south, was the only realistic alternative, and it employed 2,500 people against Mahwah's nearly 5,000. Ford acknowledged it could not say how many Mahwah workers might eventually be absorbed there. The honest answer, though no one from the company said it plainly, was not many. Inside the plant, the final weeks took on a quality that older workers would describe years later as both unbearably slow and impossibly fast. The line moved, the cars rolled, supervisors still walked the floor, time clocks still got punched. But the rituals of a working factory had acquired the quality of performance. People going through motions that everyone understood were almost over. Workers began taking things, not stealing exactly, more like collecting. A bolt, a stamped piece of trim, a work glove worn soft from years of use. Small objects that could carry the weight of memory when the building itself was gone. Men who had spent 20 years never thinking about the plant as a place, just as the place, as permanent as weather, suddenly saw it with new eyes. The width of the aisles, the height of the ceiling, the way the light came through the clear-story windows in the late afternoon and fell across the line in long yellow bars. They were memorizing it. June 19th, 1980. The night shift clocked in for the last time. Outside, the Ramapough Mountains caught the last of the evening light. The Erie Railroad spur sat quiet. Fewer cars coming in now, the supply chain already winding down. Inside, the line ran through the night one final time. In the morning, it would be over. The day shift clocked in at the usual hour. There was nothing ceremonial about the morning. The line started the way it always started, the hum building from one end of the building to the other, the conveyor engaging, the first frames moving into position. Supervisors took their stations. Workers picked up their tools. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead across 10 miles of assembly aisle, the same light that had fallen on this floor every working day for 25 years. But the parking lot told a different story. Cars filled the lots in numbers that hadn't been seen on a regular shift in months. Workers who had already been laid off in the earlier rounds of cutbacks had come back. Not to work. Their badges no longer opened the doors. They came to be there, to stand in the lot with the people they had worked alongside for a decade or two, to witness the end of something that had organized the rhythms of their adult lives. Wives came. Some brought children. A few retirees made the drive from Brooklyn, from Patterson, from Rockland County across the state line. They stood in the June morning and waited. Inside, the line moved toward its conclusion with the same mechanical indifference it had always shown to human feeling. The Fairmonts and Zephyrs took shape in their stations, the way they had taken shape every day for the past 2 years. Body panels fitted, engines lowered, interiors trimmed. Wheels torqued to specification. The workers moved through the process with a precision born of repetition, so deep it had become reflex. Hands that had performed these exact motions thousands of times performed them one final time without needing to be told how. At some point in the afternoon, the last car reached the end of the line. A Ford Fairmont one of the compact sedans that had been Mahwah's primary product in its final years, rolled off the assembly floor and through the delivery doors into the June sunlight. The exact time was not recorded for history. No executive was present to mark the moment with a speech. There was no ribbon, no ceremony, no commemorative plaque handed to the last worker whose hands had touched the car. The vehicle moved out of the building the way every other vehicle had moved out of the building. Quietly on its own wheels, headed for a transport rack and eventually a dealership somewhere in the Northeast. 6 million cars, and then one more. Then the line stopped. The sound that followed was something the workers would remember for the rest of their lives. Not a dramatic silence, not a sudden crash, but a gradual unwinding. The conveyor slowing, the pneumatic tools going quiet one by one. The hum that had been the permanent backdrop of their working lives fading section by section, station by station, until the building held only the sound of people, footsteps, voices, someone, somewhere near the back of the floor, crying without trying to hide it. Workers began moving toward the exits, not rushing. There was nowhere to be. Just moving the way people move when they understand that staying will not change anything. But leaving feels impossible. The plant was still standing. It just wasn't a plant anymore. In the parking lot, UAW Local 906 had set up a microphone. Joseph O'Hara, president of the local, stood before several hundred workers and their families in the June afternoon and read from a prepared statement. His voice was steady, but the words were not the words of a man who believed anything he was saying would matter. They were the words of a man fulfilling an obligation. To name what had happened, to put language around a loss that was still too large and too fresh to be fully felt. The trauma of a plant closing has touched the lives of hundreds of thousands of UAW people across this country, he said. The dimension of the tragedy could not be imagined until it struck our own lives. He talked about greed, about short-sightedness, about corporate boardrooms that had made decisions without thinking about the communities those decisions would unmake. He talked about government policies that had put the burden of fighting inflation on the backs of workers. He was angry, and he had the right to be angry. And the anger landed in the parking lot like something solid, something the crowd could hold on to when nothing else was available to hold. Then the microphone was passed to other union officials, and they said similar things in similar language. And the afternoon moved on the way afternoons do, indifferently, toward evening. When the speeches were over, people stood in the lot and didn't leave. There was no natural exit from the moment, no next thing to do, no place the occasion was pointing toward. Some workers exchanged phone numbers, promising to stay in touch, knowing with the particular knowledge of people who have worked side by side for years that they probably wouldn't. The plant had been the reason they knew each other. Without it, the connection had no infrastructure to run on. The gates closed sometime that evening. Not with drama. A security guard made his rounds. The locks engaged. The building that had produced 6 million vehicles over 25 years stood dark and quiet inside its fence line. The assembly line frozen at whatever position it had been in when the power went off. Frames half-fitted. Stations abandoned mid-process. The physical record of an interrupted rhythm. Ford kept a staff of 50 maintenance workers on site through the following months, performing the minimum necessary to keep the building from deteriorating while the company looked for a buyer. The Japanese manufacturers, who had briefly seemed interested, Datsun, Toyota, had not made offers. The building sat, the lot emptied, the railroad spur went quiet. It took more than 4 years to tear the plant down. By 1984, the Mahwah assembly plant was rubble. The 10 miles of assembly aisle, the 50 acres under one roof, the 2.5 million square feet of manufacturing space, all of it reduced to cleared ground. The railroad tracks were pulled up, the parking lots were broken apart. Eventually, a Sharp Electronics headquarters rose on the site, followed by a Sheraton hotel. Clean buildings. Quiet buildings. Buildings that gave no indication of what had stood there before. There is no historical marker at the site today. The town of Mahwah kept one thing from the years when the plant ran. The high school athletic teams still carry the name Ford gave its most iconic car. They are still called the Thunderbirds. The workers of Mahwah lost their jobs on June 20th, 1980. The people of Ringwood had been losing something else for years, and most of them didn't yet have a word for it. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, families in the Upper Ringwood neighborhood began noticing patterns that didn't have obvious explanations. A neighbor diagnosed with cancer, then another, a child with developmental problems, a cluster of miscarriages on a single street. Illness that seemed to move through the community the way illness doesn't usually move. Not randomly, not the way flu moves or age moves, but with a strange geographic logic. Concentrated in certain hollows, certain hillsides, certain streets where the well water had a particular taste, and the soil along the creek banks sometimes showed streaks of unnatural color. The Ramapough Lenape families, who made up most of Upper Ringwood's population, had lived in these hills long enough to know what the land was supposed to look like. They knew which streams ran clear and which ran strange. They knew where the old mine pits were because their grandparents had worked those mines, and they knew that the colorful slabs hardening in the soil near certain roads, the reds and yellows and blues that their children had played near for years, had arrived sometime in the late 1960s when Ford's trucks were making their regular runs up from Mahwah. What they didn't know was what was in those slabs: lead, arsenic, chromium, benzene, antimony, polychlorinated biphenyls. The paint sludge that Ford had deposited in the Ringwood Hills contained a catalog of industrial toxins, some of them carcinogenic, all of them dangerous at sustained exposure levels. Testing conducted years later would find lead concentrations in the soil near residential properties at 100 times the established safety threshold. The contamination had moved through the soil, into the groundwater, into the wells that Ramapough families drew their drinking water from, into the streams where children swam in summer. One road in Upper Ringwood acquired a name that no street should have to carry: Van Dunk Lane. Residents called it Cancer Road. Not as a figure of speech, as a description. Nearly every household on that road had been touched by the disease, a density of illness so far outside statistical norms that it could not be explained by chance or genetics or lifestyle. It could only be explained by the ground the houses sat on and the water that ran beneath them. Ford had left Mahwah in 1980. In Ringwood, they had never really left at all. In 1983, the Environmental Protection Agency added Ringwood mines to the National Priorities List. It was a designation that carried a specific and sobering meaning. Among the thousands of contaminated sites in the United States, Ringwood was among the most toxic. The Superfund program, created by Congress in 1980, the same year Mahwah closed, was designed to force responsible parties to pay for cleanup of the sites they had poisoned. Ford was identified as the responsible party. Cleanup began. In 1994, the EPA declared the cleanup complete. Ford had removed approximately 8,300 cubic yards of paint sludge and contaminated soil. The agency signed off on the remediation. Ringwood Mines was removed from the National Priorities List. Officially, the problem was solved. The people of Upper Ringwood knew it wasn't. In 1995, new pockets of paint sludge were discovered. In 1998, more. In 2004, residents and environmental advocates pushed for fresh testing of residential properties. The results confirmed what the community had been saying for years. The cleanup had been superficial. Ford had removed what was visible from roads and obvious access points and left the rest. Buried deeper, pushed into mine shafts, sealed under donated parkland. The contamination that remained was not a trace. It was thousands of tons of material that had simply been harder to reach and easier to ignore. In 2005, the Bergen Record published a 5-part investigative series called Toxic Legacy: 8 months of reporting, interviews with residents, scientists, government officials, and Ford representatives. The series documented the full scope of what Ford had done at Ringwood and the full inadequacy of what had been done to address it. It generated a political pressure that the EPA could not absorb quietly. In 2006, the EPA relisted Ringwood Mines on the National Priorities List. It was the first time in the history of the Superfund program that a site had been removed from the list and then returned to it. The only site. Out of more than 1,000 sites that had ever been designated, Ringwood Mines stood alone, not as a success story of American environmental remediation, but as its most visible failure. That same year, roughly 600 members of the Ramapough Lenape Nation's Turtle Clan filed a class action lawsuit against Ford. The case was called Man v. Ford, named for Wayne Mann, a community leader whose family had lived in the Ringwood Hills for generations and who had watched his neighbors get sick for decades without anyone in a position of authority acknowledging why. The lawsuit became the subject of an HBO documentary. It ran for 5 years. In 2009, facing the possibility that Ford might enter bankruptcy during the financial crisis and leave them with nothing, the Ramapough accepted a settlement. 600 people, decades of illness, generations of contaminated land, $11 million. Divided among the plaintiffs, it came to roughly $18,000 per person. For a lifetime of exposure, for the cancers and the birth defects and the chronic illnesses and the land their ancestors had held since before New Jersey was a state. Angel Stefanschik, 22 years old at a 2022 press conference, put it without ceremony. "I lost my grandmother to cancer," she said. "I have a list of chronic illnesses because of what has been done to me." She was born 16 years after Ford closed the Mahwah plant. The poison didn't care. In June 2022, 42 years after the last Fairmont rolled off the Mahwah line, the state of New Jersey filed a new lawsuit against Ford Motor Company. This one was different from Man vs. Ford. It was not about personal injury or property damage. It was about something harder to quantify and in some ways harder to argue against: the destruction of natural resources that belong to everyone. The Ringwood Hills, the forests, the wetlands, the streams, the groundwater, had been damaged in ways that went beyond the harm done to individual families. The contamination had spread across 6.2 acres of wetlands. It had reached the watershed feeding the Wanakay Reservoir, the drinking water source for 2.5 million New Jersey residents. It had killed species and altered ecosystems in ways that no settlement check could reverse. New Jersey's acting Attorney General, Matthew Platkin, stood in Ringwood State Park, built partly on land Ford had donated without disclosing its contamination, and delivered a sentence that carried the weight of 4 decades of institutional failure. "Today we hold Ford accountable for knowingly polluting some of the state's most precious environmental assets," he said, then walking away without disclosing the toxic mess they had made or attempting to mitigate the harm. Ford, through a spokesperson, said the company took its environmental responsibilities seriously and had worked cooperatively with regulators throughout the remediation process. The cleanup at Ringwood was still ongoing. Since the 2006 relisting, Ford had removed more than 5,500 tons of paint sludge and contaminated soil from the site, more than 6 times what had been removed in the original cleanup that the EPA had declared sufficient in 1994. The number was staggering. It was also, to the people of Upper Ringwood, simply a confirmation of what they had always known. The first cleanup had never been real. The tons now being hauled away were tons that had been left behind deliberately or negligently, or both, when Ford signed off on a remediation designed to close a file rather than solve a problem. The Wanakay Reservoir question remained open. Groundwater testing had identified cancer-linked chemicals moving toward the reservoir's watershed. The EPA had announced a long-term plan for groundwater cleanup without specifying a timeline. Environmental scientists warned that climate change, intensifying rainfall, flooding, soil disruption, could accelerate the movement of buried contaminants in ways that made the existing timeline inadequate. 2.5 million people drink from that watershed. They do not know the name Ringwood Mines. Most of them have never heard of the Ford plant at Mahwah. But what Ford buried in those hills in the late 1960s is still, in a very literal sense, moving toward them. In May 2025, the Sheraton Hotel that had been built on the former Mahwah plant site was demolished. An implosion brought it down in seconds. The building that had replaced the building that had replaced the factory collapsing into its own footprint in a controlled sequence of charges. Spectators gathered to watch. Someone filmed it on a phone. The dust settled over the cleared ground where 10 miles of assembly line had once run, and when it cleared, there was nothing. No hotel, no factory. No marker of any kind to indicate what the land had once been or what it had once meant. A Mahwah official told reporters there had been discussions about the site's future. Housing, perhaps, or warehouses, or a business park. Nothing had been decided. For now, there was just the land. 45 years after the plant closed, Mahwah was still figuring out what comes next. Some things had not changed. On Friday nights in the fall, the Mahwah High School Thunderbirds took the field under the lights. The name had outlasted the factory by nearly half a century. A mascot chosen to honor a car that was itself named for a mythological bird of the American Southwest, layered symbol upon symbol. The original meaning receding further with each passing generation of students who wore the name without knowing its origin. They ran their plays and celebrated their touchdowns on ground that sat a few miles from where the plant once stood, in a town whose low property tax rate was a distant memory of the years when Ford picked up so much of the bill. What does it mean to carry the name of something still unresolved? Bruce Springsteen asked the question differently. In 1982, 2 years after the gates closed, he released Nebraska, a spare acoustic album recorded on a home cassette player in his Colts Neck bedroom, populated by characters from the margins of the American economy. One of them was Ralph, the protagonist of Johnny 99. Ralph had worked at the Mahwah plant. Ralph had lost his job when it closed. Ralph had lost his house when the money ran out. Ralph, in the grip of whiskey and despair, had fired a shot that put him in front of a judge. Springsteen didn't editorialize. He just told the story. The Mahwah assembly plant lived for 25 years. It built 6 million vehicles. It employed thousands of workers who used its wages to build lives that the closure then unmade. It poisoned a mountain community and spent decades trying not to fully account for what it had done. It was the largest auto plant in America. It left no marker. What it left instead was in the ground, in the hills above Ringwood, in the watershed below, in the soil of a community that had been there long before the factory arrived and is still there now. Still waiting for the poison to be gone, still waiting for someone with the power to fix it to decide that fixing it completely is worth the cost. The Thunderbirds still take the field on Friday nights. The cleanup is still ongoing, and somewhere in the Ramapough Mountains, in ground that Ford bought and poisoned and donated and walked away from, the sludge is still moving.